Uh, okay, so what we want to do today is follow the pattern of reading the story on multiple levels, on the pshat, the simple level, on the historical perspective, and the spiritual perspective or Hasidic perspective. But till now we've been doing sort of a verse at a time. But I want to first today focus on the last on about 4 or 5 verses and give the big picture, and then we'll try to unpack each one specifically. We may or may not finish unpacking everything today, but we want to get the big picture to see where this story is going. So just to as an introduction, we want to read to the end of the first segment. The first segment, according to most opinions, does not end at the end of the first chapter. I mentioned earlier that from the Jewish perspective, the division of the chapters are totally and completely irrelevant. It was not a Jewish division. It was not made by the Jews. We just use it for convenience. Where does the song end? As we will see, the song is going to end. The first section is going to end in the beginning of chapter 2, which I'll point out where that is. And it ends with a phrase that repeats itself multiple times throughout the song. It's not exactly clear what that phrase means, but we'll elaborate it according to the various opinions. But just as an overview, we're going to run into a problem at the end of the first section. And the problem is a problem that I alluded to before, but here you will see how it comes to the fore. And we hit a brick wall. What's the brick wall? The brick wall is that in this relationship, at least in the pshat, in the simple level, in this relationship, the man and the woman are not on the same page in the sense that their level of excitement is not compatible. In other words, the man would like the relationship. He's fine. He certainly loves her. He calls her my beloved. He calls her beautiful. He's willing to praise all wonderful and nice things. But is he as passionate as her? No. Is he interested in solidifying the relationship through moving in together, through marriage, through embracing? Not really. She is completely emotional. He's much colder. She's burning hot, and he's much colder. And this is going on for the last couple of verses, as we pointed out, and it's going to continue today until you hit the brick wall. And at the brick wall, one way of reading it is she learns a lesson. What's the lesson? Don't get too excited prematurely. That's the lesson, because she is very excited. He's not. And then we get to that point, we take a break. What's the break? Now we shift perspectives and we start talking about his perspective. Till now, she is in the center, how she feels, what she imagines, how she asks him a question, how he relates to her. In the second section, you will see it shifts. We go up to a different period. It shifts as a shift, and it comes from his perspective. And what happens, I'll give you the preview. What happens is, again, the temperatures are not equal. He gets super excited and she's not. She comes running to him and she says, come back later. And again, that same verse, that same theme is going to appear, that a big challenge in the story is, can we get the temperatures right? When she is super hot, could she get him excited, and vice versa? And that's the problem with this. And that's where the story shifts according to the simple meaning that we're not on the same page. Not that we're not in a relationship, not that we don't like each other, not that we don't praise each other, not that we don't think each other as beautiful, but the problem is, it's how invested you are and how much you want it and how passionate you are. And that's often, that's a very big frustration in any building in any relationship, is even if we're both willing to date, even if we're willing to work on this relationship, is our level of excitement and commitment and passion, if it's not on the same page, it's not going to work. And that's the frustration that we're going to read about the beginning of chapter 2, which is really the end of the first section, like I said, and then we shift to another perspective. So that is the issue. So what I'm going to do now, I'm going to share this screen, read a few verses. I think it's 4 or 5, I don't remember, maybe 6. And then we'll see how what I said plays out in the verses. then we want to go back and look at each one from the historical perspective and from the spiritual perspective as well. So we'll see what happens. You know what? Maybe it actually makes sense to read the end of the last chapter for a second, just to point out that, okay, this was the song. Right, we discussed this last week. He says, behold, you are comely, my beloved. Behold, you are comely, your eyes are like doves. He says to her, you're beautiful, you have beautiful eyes. Wonderful. What does she say? Behold, you are comely, my beloved. Ye pleasant, also our couch is leafy. The beams of our houses are cedars. He's willing to say you're beautiful. She's already shopping for furniture, right? She's already calling the real estate agent to find a home for them. He's not there yet. Okay, so that is the end of last chapter. But again, we're still in the same. Don't worry about the chapter breaks. Chapter break is completely irrelevant. So she sees she's not going anywhere. So what does she have to do? She has to praise herself. I am a rose of Sharon, a rose of the valleys. Rashi says you'd rather be a rose of the valley than a rose on the hill. At least in Israel, the rose on the hill gets dried out, too much sun. The rose of the valley, much more moist, and it's more beautiful. So she praises herself. He's willing to go along with her. Remember, he's very happy to send text messages and praise. So he hears her saying she's a rose. He goes along with the metaphor. As a rose among the thorns, so is my beloved among the daughters. That's what he says. She says she's the rose of the valley. He says, oh, you know what? You're actually better than everybody else. That's one thing we want to hear. We want to hear that you like me, but I'd rather hear, but it's even better when you tell me I'm much better than everybody else in your eyes. So that's what he says. He says, you're a rose among the thorns. So is my beloved among the daughters. That's it. That's all he says, a praise. Look what she does back to him. She follows the same pattern. If I'm a rose among the horn, if I'm a rose, if she's a rose among the thorns, then she goes back to him with the same pattern as an apple tree among the trees of the forest. Trees of the forest are the barren trees that don't give fruit. As an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the sons, right? He says, you are like a rose among the thorns in comparison to the other daughters. So she takes that. Why is he complimenting her? Because he sees that she needs a compliment. She's praising herself. So what does she do? She's very smart. She's actually much quicker than him. She throws back the same pattern. She says, if I'm a rose amongst the thorns, you're like an apple tree amongst the forests, amongst the trees that are barren. But look what happens now. In his shade I delighted and sat, and his fruit was sweet to my palate. You're not just an apple tree. You're an apple tree that I sit in your shade and I want to eat you. I want to internalize this relationship. You see how she's taking that metaphor, that contrast, that a pattern of speech, but she's upgrading it. He brought me to the banquet hall, and his attraction to me was symbolic of a. Don't worry, this is the Rashi. He brought me to his banquet hall, and his attraction to me is love. What is she saying? Right away, he says, he's giving her a praise. You're beautiful. You're like a rose amongst the thorns outside. What does she say? I want to sit in your shade. I want to eat your fruit. Bring me to the banquet hall. Let's drink wine. Beit hayayin. Beit hayayin. Banquet hall is a bad translation. Literally, bring me to the house of the wine. Vidiglo, and his attraction to me is symbolic of love. We'll see what that means. And then look at the next verse. Sustain me with flagons of wine. Spread my bed with apples, for I am lovesick. Cholat ahava. We'll talk about that too. Okay, so again, he's willing to give her a praise. She's burning up with love. She's lovesick. Lovesick is when someone is so in love he can't think about anything else. And let's think about what she's saying. Sustain. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. Right? She's sitting and dreaming about an embrace. He's not there yet. All he did in verse number 2, by mistake, he gave her a praise. Why did he give her a praise? Because she really wants it. But look what she does in response to his one praise. Verse 3, verse 4, verse 5, verse 6. She keeps praising him, not just praising him. She's talking about consuming the fruit, sitting in his shade. I'm lovesick. I'm burning up with love. Embrace me. He's holding me under my head. His left hand is under my head. His right hand embraces me. That's obviously a image of intimacy and closeness. Where is he? He's gone. I mean, he's not there yet. So now you get to verse 7. Verse 7 is the brick wall that we mentioned. What is the takeaway? So I'm going to read the verse. Okay, this is a translation. It's hard to do. I'll try to read the verse, and it's open for interpretation. I'll give you the interpretation that I want to offer. In other words, in the Eben Ezra, that's the one I'm following. Rashi deviates a little bit from the Pshat. But okay, here we go. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem. Who's speaking? She's speaking. She realizes the problem. She realizes that she's completely invested. She's burning up with love. That guy, more than a few praises, he's not going anywhere. So I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the hinds of the fields. So he's provoking the image of the animals, that you neither awaken. Okay. Literally, the verse reads as follows: if you awaken or arouse the love until it is desirous. Rashi writes while, but it's until. Literally, ad shetechpatz. Look at verse 7. If you know a little bit of Hebrew, Yishbati etchem, I adjure you, make you swear, the daughters of Jerusalem, bitzvaot, tzvi is a deer, with the gazelles, or bayelot hasadeh, or the hinds of the field. If you awaken, im ta'iru, if you awaken, im te'oreru, another, it's the same root. Ta'iru is to wake up. Te'oreru is another term to wake up. So here they translate wake up, awaken, or arouse, same idea. Rashi disagrees, but we're not going to go with Rashi for right now. The love until shetechpatz, until it is desirous. What is this verse saying? What is he saying? So one interpretation, at least according to the Pshat, the interpretation is she tells her she comes back from the date and she tells her friends say, knew what happened. She says, let me tell you, let me give you a life lesson. Life lesson is don't awaken the love within yourself. Don't get too excited until the right time comes. What's the right time? The right time when he's also in the mood. And that's the frustration of the first half of the song. And again, according to many people, according to many interpretations, verse 7 of chapter 2 is the end of the first unit. So that is the pshat. Now, what we have to do is we have to unpack these verses 1 through 7 on the historic level, also on the Kabbalistic level. I don't know that we'll finish all of them today, but I felt like we want to read them all in one unit so we get the feeling, the overview of what's happening, at least in the pshat, in the simple level, has to be read. It has to be read together. And now we could start unpacking, but in the meantime, if any questions, comments, jokes, personal experiences, no, I'm joking. You could, if you want to, please share. Otherwise, we start digging in and we start getting specific. Okay, let's start with the historic perspective, which we're going to go to Rashi for that. Show Rashi's commentary. Okay, so Rashi doesn't address the first one. I'm a rose. She's a rose. Okay, why is she a rose? I mentioned before. Rashi said, "Rose amongst the valleys. This is prettier than rose of the mountains because it is always moist, since the sun has no strength there. So in the valley, you get some shade from the mountains, and therefore, it turns out the roses are more beautiful. If you happen to be a rose on top of the mountain, you're in trouble. You're going to dry out, especially in the heat of the summer in Israel." Okay. Now, what is this thing? He praises her. He says, as a rose among the thorns, so is my beloved among the daughters. Okay. As a rose among the thorns, reads Rashi, which pierce it, but it remains constant in its beauty and its redness. So is my beloved among the daughters. They entice her to pursue them, to stray like them after strange gods or foreign gods, but they remain firm in her faith. What does Rashi say? Rashi says, we are beautiful. Who's we, the Jewish people? He's praising us, right? It's clear that he's getting to a point. This is the first point where there's some exclusivity. In other words, he's saying, he's praising her in contrast better than everybody else. You'll see later, it's not such a simple matter for him because he's got all kinds of girls running after him. We actually alluded to it before, but he's got all kinds of girls running after him, and we'll talk about that later in the song. But right now, for the first time, till now he's saying, yes, you're beautiful, but a lot of people can be beautiful. Here's the first time where he says, you are like a rose among the thorns. So here is, you're more beautiful than everybody else. So what does this mean in the historical perspective? So it's not just you're like a rose amongst other flowers that are not as nice. He says thorns. Thorns are pricky. They're prickly. They prick the they prick the rose. In other words, this is a metaphor for the nations of the world who are oppressing the Jews. And they're oppressing the Jews because they want the Jewish people to abandon their relationship with God. And yet we remain loyal. That's the just remain beautiful. We remain a rose. And that's Rashi, that's Rashi's interpretation from the historic perspective. So this is referring to God praising the Jewish people that despite the thorns, despite the getting pricked, and despite being persecuted, they still retain their beauty. They still remain a rose. But again, what is a rose? A rose is what is the beauty? The beauty is they maintain their relationship with God. So that's what God tells us. Now, what do we tell him? We tell him, as an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the sons. So God is like an apple tree amongst the other trees. Now, what is the issue with the apple tree? So we'll see in a minute. There's an advantage to be to the apple tree and which bears fruit, and then there's an advantage to the trees that don't bear fruit. So God is like the apple tree in our eyes, but the other nations don't want to go to the apple tree. They want to go to the trees of the forest. So let's read Rashi. So the first thing we read, as an apple tree among the trees of the forest. When an apple tree is among trees that do not bear fruit, it is more beloved than them all, for its fruit is good in both taste and fragrance, right? If you happen to be hungry, and if you have an apple tree amongst other trees that bear fruit, okay, so it's not an apple, it's a peach. Who cares, right? But if you're going to a forest and there are not many fruit trees, and then you find the apple tree amongst the trees of the forest, oh, that's even more beautiful. So is my beloved among the sons, among the young men. The allegory is that, so is the Holy One, blessed be he, chosen above all gods. Therefore, in his shade I delighted and sat. The Medrash Agada states, this apple tree, all flee from it because it has no shade. So did the nations flee from the Holy One, blessed be he, at the giving of the Torah. But I, in his shade, I delighted and sat. So I don't know about all apple trees, but when we go apple picking up in Fairfield County, Upper Fairfield County, you see the apple trees don't give you much shade. So what is the metaphor here? If you are the nations of the world, they are looking for the trees of the forest. Trees of the forest will give you more shade. So when God offers, do you want a relationship with me? They say, we're out of here. We want shade. We want protection elsewhere from the idols. We're choosing God over the other gods, not because God has more shade. Shade represents protection. In this physical world, we don't always feel protected because God's presence is concealed, but we like the apple. What's the apple? The tastes and the fragrance, which represents the great joy that we get from the relationship with God. So from the historic perspective, in verse 2, when God praises us that we are like a rose amongst the thorns, God is saying, wow, you are, to me, I see that you're loyal to me, and that's why you're like the rose much more than the other people, especially the people who are trying to distract you from the relationship with me. And we now turn to God and say, we appreciate you and we love you more than the other gods, more than the trees of the forest. So what he does to her, she does to him. He says, wow, you're more beautiful than the other nations in your commitment to God. We say, well, you're more beautiful, you're more meaningful to us than the other gods. So I hope that makes sense. I hope I'm being clear. But in any case, that's the historical perspective. And now we want to start getting a little bit into the Hasidic perspective. Lisa may ask me for the Kabbalistic perspective, but I didn't have a chance to look at that. All the kids are home. So maybe that will wait for a few minutes. So we'll first give the Hasidic perspective, and then we'll see if we have time to peek into the Kabbalistic perspective. Let's see how much we can pack in here because I want to. Okay, we'll start from the beginning. Again, we're rereading these verses from the perspective of the Hasidic perspective, which is basically this is now not referring to history; it's referring to our relationship with God. So let's start with this. God is praising us, the soul, as a rose among the thorns. So is my beloved among the daughters. In this context, we have the rose amongst we have my beloved amongst the daughters. Who's my beloved? That's the soul. But the soul is not exclusive. There are other daughters there. What are the other daughters? The other daughters, from the reading of Hasidic philosophy, the other daughters is the other desires that the soul possesses. In other words, in our psyche, we have the godly soul, the soul that's part of God, that wants to connect to God, that loves God. But the godly soul is not exclusively is not the only one living within our psyche. We also have what they call the animal soul, or the natural soul, or the self-oriented soul. Call it what you want. But we have two basic drives: the drive to transcend, to connect to God. That's the spirit. That's the godly spark. We'll call it the godly soul. And then you have the energy of the soul, the animal soul, the more physical soul that wants pleasure, is self-oriented and is focused on self. We call it the animal soul because the animal is natural. The animal wants to survive. It's not interested in things that are beyond the self. So when I look at my soul and what's in my heart, there's a love to God. Of course, sometimes it has to be cultivated, but it's there. But there are also other loves, and there are other loves, and some of those loves are actually destructive. So what the verse is saying, well, God is praising the soul. God is saying, look, you are my beloved, but you're not alone. You're also amongst the other loves. Now, the other loves are actually thorns. The thorn pricks at the rose. In other words, the other loves interfere and distract the soul from loving God. It's very hard to love God and love a destructive force in your soul at the same time. Right? They're opposites. So ultimately, there's this tension between the rose and the thorn. And the rose is my beloved, and the thorn is the other girl, the other daughters. The other daughters are the other loves. And the praise is, wow, even though the soul comes into this world, even though the soul is surrounded and inundated by foreign loves, which are like the thorns that actually undermine her focus, the soul's focus on the love of God. Nevertheless, the soul, the first step is going to be, nevertheless, the soul retains its beauty. The rose retains its beauty in the sense that it still is loyal to God. It still has that love of God. That love of God is not going to be destroyed by the other thorns. That is the first layer in this building. The second layer is what we said earlier. We discussed this, I think it was verse 4. Now we come to the Hasidic idea. The Hasidic idea here is that, and that's going to be a big part of the, I think, the overarching point of this entire book from the Hasidic perspective, is that the challenge, not only does the challenge not undermine the soul, but the challenge actually intensifies the love. The challenge intensifies the love of God. So when the soul enters into this world, when the soul's in heaven, it has a certain degree of love to God. But when the soul enters the world and then it's challenged, and its relationship with God is challenged, and has no choice but to work harder and intensify the love, and it comes out with a greater love to God because it's a love that was created because of the challenge. Think about it as a little stream. You have a stream, the water's flowing very quietly. If you start blocking the stream, you start putting in stones, all of a sudden, what you're going to get is the river, the stream becoming more passionate. You're going to see the water becoming more intensified. You're going to start getting white water. Why? That becomes the obstacle. That's a physical metaphor for the obstacle causes the water to flow to intensify. So too, the other loves, the negative loves that the soul is faced with actually intensify the love of God. Where do you see this in the metaphor? So this is actually from the Zohar. The Zohar says, when the Zohar quotes this verse, the Zohar says If you have a rose amongst the thorns, what do the thorns do? The thorns, I mentioned till now, the thorns prickle and prick the rose, threatening to puncture it and threatening to ruin it. But on the other hand, there's also a positive force that the thorns have for the rose. And that is that if you think about this image of the rose and the thorns are pushing the rose. But what happens if you move the rose around? The Zohar says that the smell emerges, right? If you have a beautiful flower, you shake it up, all of a sudden now you get to the greater smell. So the relationship between the negative loves within the human psyche, from the animal soul to the rose, to the love of God, of the godly soul, is like the thorn amongst, it's like a rose amongst a thorn. On one hand, the rose is threatened by the thorn because the thorn could hurt it and distract it and puncture it. On the other hand, the thorn actually intensifies the fragrance, because when the thorn pushes the rose, the smell, salka recha is Aramaic, the smell will emerge and the smell will go up. So that is the first element of how God praises us, that although our loved, my beloved, in other words, the woman, the man is praising the woman, saying, although you are a rose, but you're amongst the thorns, nevertheless you retain your beauty. That's level number one. Level number two, not only you retain your beauty, not only you retain your love to God, but actually the love to God is intensified because of the obstacles. So that's step one. Now we have to go to what we respond, and yes, so that's step one. So in the meantime, if anyone comments, questions, please share. Otherwise, we move ahead. Next verse. Let's go to the next verse. As an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the sons. In his shade I delighted and sat, and his fruit was sweet to my palate. So how we get here, you'll give me a minute, I'll show you how we get here. But the big picture is going to be as follows. We are referring to the relationship with God, and we're referring to the full spectrum of experiences that we experience in the month of Tishrei, in the month of the high holidays. What happens in the high holidays? High holidays, the beginning of the month is a month of reflection, introspection. It's a day, Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment, okay? So it's not a time where we necessarily feel love of God. We much more are in awe. The first half of the month is the awe. The second half of the month, even though most Jews don't know about the second half of the month, which is a shame, second half of the month, you get to the joy. You have the 7-day holiday of Sukkot, where we sit in the shade of the sukkah, and we celebrate. And then you get the 8th day. The 8th day is Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, and Simchat Torah, where we go back in the house. But in other words, the first half of the month is awe, second half of the month is joy. And that's the sort of the full spectrum of the relationship, as we will see in a moment. In the next verses, that you have the left side and the right side, you have awe and you have love. And they're both important, they're both critical to the relationship, as we discussed many times. Just a joke. The Jew comes to shul only once a year on Yom Kippur. And the rabbi one day asks him, he says, look, it's nice to see you once a year, but it'd be wonderful if you come more often. So the guy says, I'm not coming more often. He says, why? He says, he tells the rabbi, well, the service is very boring. He says, really? Why is the service so boring? He says, every time I come, you're saying Kol Nidre. So that's why the service is boring. But of course, what I'm trying to say is that if you get stuck in the first half of the month, then Judaism is very judgmental, because retrospection, you have to ask yourself, what do I have to fix? You're not feeling love. You're not feeling the unconditional love of God. To the contrary, you're feeling the judgment of where can I improve? Where do I have to improve for this relationship to continue? But that's only the first half of the month. You get to the second half of the month and you celebrate the love and the unconditional love of God in the Sukkah, as we will elaborate. Okay, so what are we saying here? Let's look at this for a second. As an apple tree amongst the tree of the forests, so is my beloved among the sons. So what Hasidic philosophy does, and quotes a verse from Job. The verse from Job refers to the sons, as the angels. There's a verse in Job that says, right in chapter 1, that God is sitting, and Vayavo b'nei Elokim, the sons of God, come before God, amongst them Satan. You know the story with Job, that Satan comes to God and says, well, you think Job is such a great guy, let's test him, and God goes along with it. That's the book of Job. We'll do that another time. But what we're talking about here is that we're trying to derive from there that the verse, God is sitting on his throne, and the sons of God come and stand before God. Amongst them Satan. What's the sons of God? Sons of God are the angels. So what are we saying here? We're saying that God, that my beloved, God amongst the angels is like the apple amongst the trees of the forest. And we're going to get to that metaphor as well, because according to the Kabbalah, the trees of the forest, Atzei Hayar, actually according to the Medrash, Atzei Hayar, the trees of the forest, are also referred to angels. We'll get to that later, how we figure that out. So what was so far was trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. So now, the sons of God come before God. When do they come? When do they come before God? The Zohar says actually at the verse in Job refers to Rosh Hashanah. So when you hear about the sons of God, these are the angels of the sons of God. The sons of God come before God and they demand justice. They say they're angels, so they don't understand human challenge. They don't understand the difficulties of living on this earth. But like with Job, they say, look, we have to. We're standing up, so to speak, standing up. The sons, just like the sons stand up for the honor of their father, the angels come and they're prosecuting angels. They say, look, the soul that descends into this world is not living up to what it's supposed to be. It's distracted and it gets involved in negativity, and they demand an accounting. That's the attribute of judgment. These are the angels that awaken judgment, and that's what Rosh Hashanah is. So let's read the verse for a second. So these are the sons. These are the sons. What is Dodi? What is my beloved? The beautiful thing here is that we refer to God even on Rosh Hashanah as Dodi. Dodi is my beloved. Rosh Hashanah, you don't expect amongst the sons of God, you don't expect to use the term my beloved. Love is the opposite of judgment. Nevertheless, what the soul is saying, that even on Rosh Hashanah, on the day of judgment, when you have the sons of God, when you have the angels demanding accountability, because they say this relationship, the soul has to live up to its responsibilities, etc. Even then, you could sense God's love to us. Cain Dodi, so is my beloved amongst the angels that are trying to awaken the attribute of justice. Now that's one element. Another element is that because we're being judged, because it's the day of judgment, because we focus on introspection, because we focus on our imperfections and our distance, we are therefore inspired to return to God and repent. And that repentance triggers the love. So one way to read this is amongst the sons, because we're reacting to the judgment of Rosh Hashanah, therefore we return to God. And when we return to God, that elicits God's love to us. So that is the my beloved amongst the sons. Now, what does this have to do with the apple? Because we talk about that there's just like my beloved is amongst the sons, which we just explained to mean that the love to God is a way that God's love to us is actually intensified because of the scrutiny of the angels, because as a result of the judgment, we work harder to correct ourselves and to return to God, and that elicits God's love. So too is the apple amongst the trees of the forest. What's the apple amongst the trees of the forest? So the trees of the forest are angels. Why that is, it's related to what we discussed last week, actually. I think it was last week, that the tree represents emotion. Because we said that intelligence is like the animal, but the tree represents emotion. We discussed that last week. You can find it on YouTube. So the trees of the forest are the animals because the animals trees of the forest are angels because the angels are primarily emotional beings. They either love God or in awe of God, but they're stuck in one place. They don't grow. The human being also has emotion, but the human being could roam. So without getting into that, trees of the forest are the angels of God. And in this context, it's the angels of God that demand justice. What is the apple? According to the Kabbalah, the apple represents compassion. The compassion of God to us, or of us to God, depending how you read it, the compassion of God to us or us to God is like the tree like the apple tree amongst the other trees. Why is apple compassion? So the apple, I'm not an expert in all apples. You go to the store, there's so many types. All I know is all my kids like is Fuji. They don't like anything else. So I don't know anything about all the different types of apples. But the apple is an interesting fruit. Why? Because it's sort of a mix of sweetness and tartness. Apple is sweet, but the apple also has the idea of bitterness. And also the colors. Apple usually has multiple colors. And from the Hasidic perspective, from the Kabbalistic perspective, anytime you have a blend represents the third sephira, the sephira of compassion, because compassion is a blend of kindness and judgment. So I want to take 60 seconds and talk about how compassion is a blend of kindness and judgment. Kindness says everybody is deserving, because kindness only sees the good in people. I want to give everybody. Deserving, not deserving, it doesn't matter. When you're kind, you want to give everybody. Then there's judgment. Judgment says, no, only give to the person who's deserving. Hold back. Don't give unconditionally. Hold back. Give to those who are deserving. Those who, that is judgment. Now there's a big gap between that. These are two extremes. As to say everybody is deserving is not everyone's deserving. Kindness sees the good, everyone's deserving. And judgment is much more critical. It wants to really criticize and say, are you really deserving or not? And at some point, if you look critically, nobody's deserving. Even Moses is not deserving. Even in this parsha, we read about Moses' sin. So ultimately, if you really take the gevura, the judgment to the extreme, nobody's deserving because nobody's perfect. So kindness, everybody is perfect. Judgment, nobody is perfect. What is compassion? Compassion is the in-between ground. And that's why compassion can make the peace between the love, between the kindness and the discipline and the judgment. How so? Because on one hand, the compassion agrees with judgment. Compassion says, indeed, that person is not deserving. So on one hand, it's sort of closer to the judgment. Unlike the kindness is everyone's deserving. Compassion doesn't say that. Compassion says the person is not deserving. Yet, compassion says, even though the person is not deserving, nevertheless, you should give them because have compassion. So here, actually, judgment could agree with compassion. Judgment doesn't agree with kindness because kindness says everyone's deserving. Judgment says nonsense. But judgment could agree with compassion when compassion says, look, judgment, you're right. The guy's not deserving, but nevertheless, could you have compassion anyway? And that is fine because judgment's not offended by that. Judgment is only offended by saying everybody's deserving. That's where judgment is offended because judgment says the guy's not deserving. So Kabbalistically, compassion is the middle. Compassion is the middle, and compassion is sort of the blend of kindness and judgment. Hence the apple. The apple is the blend of the sweetness, which is kindness, and the tartness, which is bitterness, which is the judgment. And the apple is the blend. The apple is compassion. So let's read the verse again. Like the apple tree like the compassion amongst the judgment. Right? So too is my beloved, which is the love that God has to us as a result of the introspection that happens on Rosh Hashanah, which is the sons, among the sons, because who creates this judgment on Rosh Hashanah? These are the angels demanding justice. That's the first half of the verse. We'll get back to it in a minute. Second half of the verse, as a result of the love that was awakened on Rosh Hashanah, now we get to the second half of the month. We get to the holiday of Sukkot. What happens at Sukkot? This is a perfect metaphor. In his shade, I delighted and sat. Now, if I just took this verse and say, what do you think of in Jewish life? When I say, in his shade, I delighted and sat, what are we referring to? Well, Sukkah is the first thing that will come to mind because Sukkah, you have to be in shade. The one requirement of the Sukkah is you have to have more shade than sun. So sitting in the shade of God is sitting in the Sukkah. So in the Sukkah, we're sort of surrounded by God's embrace, by God's love. When was God's love awakened? God's love to us was awakened because of the introspection and repentance that we did in the first half of the month. Then we get to experience the love in the second half of the month. But Sukkah has a certain limitation according to the Kabbalah, and that is that the Sukkah, the love to God, is makif. Makif means it surrounds, it encompasses. We're in the environment of love, but not necessarily is that love internalized. And hence the end of the verse, and his fruit was sweet to my palate, that refers to Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day. Kabbalistically, the 8th day of Sukkot is the day where we go out of the embrace of God, we come home. So what do we do then? Now we have to internalize. The word Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day, literally Atzeret could mean stop doing work. But Atzeret in biblical Hebrew has another meaning as well. Atzeret would mean to gather, sort of gather it in the cup. So what we're doing is we're gathering all the inspiration from the first 7 days of Sukkot. That was, we had an encompassing light. We feel the embrace of God, but it has not yet internalized. We will eat the fruit. Eating is a metaphor for internalization. The eating of the fruit happens throughout the rest of the year. Shmini Atzeret, and the rest of the year through studying Torah and performing the mitzvot. So again, a lot of details here, but verse 3, according to the Kabbalah, refers to this dance between judgment and compassion, between God judging us. And in that sense, what that does is that inspires us to do better, to improve, to return to God with a greater force. And that elicits God's love and God's compassion to us. And that we celebrate in the second half of the verse, celebrated specifically on Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret on the 8th day. Now, if there's any questions, I'll take any questions. Otherwise, there's one more little point that I want to say on this verse. But again, I feel like there's a lot of details. So if anybody wants to ask and clarify, please go ahead. Otherwise, we continue.
I have a question.
Yes.
Rabbi. It's about I love your definition of compassion, something between judgment and kindness. But I just checked it once more, definition of compassion. It's actually synonym to kindness, pity, sympathy, has nothing to do with the other part you described. I would love to have a definition for compassion, like you said, but
Correct.
It's not.
I agree with you, because English doesn't understand this. And you're right. In English, you're right. English doesn't have the definition for compassion. But the word that Hebrew, the equivalent for Hebrew, that the Hebrew uses, the Kabbalah explains it in the way I did. So you're right. If I don't know which dictionary you picked up, the Merriam-Webster dictionary,
Yeah.
or any other, Oxford dictionary, they didn't study Kabbalah. So they don't understand that. Yeah, they don't understand that subtlety.
Which means,
But I agree with you. Yes, that's not the common definition, but that's the capital.
because now compassion, it's to me kind of not a good word. Because not in your definition. Your definition for me, it's the only right thing, right definition for compassion. But how it's used in our daily life, it's not.
Right. So I would guess, I don't want to get personal here, but I would guess that in your perspective, I don't want to say you don't like kindness, because I don't mean that. I mean to say the Kabbalistic definition
Oh, you're breaking.
kindness, which is
Can't hear you.
seeing good, not cool. Some people are some connectivity issues here, and having some noise. I apologize for that.
Mm-hmm.
Wait a second, the noise will slow down.
So what would be the good translation of a Hebrew word compassion to English or to any other language?
I don't know that there is one.
Exactly, because I've been trying.
I don't even know. I'll be honest with you. I don't.
Oh, Rabbi, I can't hear you.
I don't know that there is a good an exact one word that captures this subtlety. I don't know. And in fact, I don't even know that the Hebrew does. But the Kabbalistic interpretation explains what they mean by compassion.
Yeah,
And
I
they
am for
clearly
it.
say that,
I am all for it. It's a great definition.
yes, 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 wonderful. Okay, I just want to say one more point. If there's any other questions, I'll take it now. Otherwise, we'll take it later. Just one more quick point, and that is make it personal in our daily life. So if you follow the prayer of the daily prayer, there's two blessings that we say that prepare us for the Shema. We say the Shema. What is Shema? Shema is a commandment, a biblical commandment to recite the Shema twice a day. What is the Shema? Shema basically has two parts. The first sentence of the Shema is declaring the unity of God. The unity of God, God is one. That's the first sentence of the Shema. The second sentence of then there's another sentence that was inserted. We'll talk about that next week because it ties into next week. And then this V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God is the second idea. So we have to think about the unity of God, and then that will awaken within us a love to God. Okay. The problem is that maybe in biblical times it was easy to just think about God for 1 second and the love is awakened. But later the rabbis realized that people actually need to get in the mood. You have to prepare them. So the rabbis wrote two blessings that will prepare us for the Shema, called Birchot Kriyat Shema, the blessings of the Shema. What do we do? What do we do in these two blessings? So what we do in these two blessings is the first blessing. It's quite a long blessing, and that blessing is we think about the angels. Believe it or not, we plagiarize from the angels. We talk about the different forms of angels, and we talk about the meditation or the song that the angels sing. Holy, 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 Kadosh, 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 which is a quote from Isaiah, and that's Isaiah's describing what the angels say. And then we have the other verse, Baruch Hashem Kamo, blessed is the Lord from his place. We're talking about the angels. That's the first blessing. Why are we talking about the angels? Because by thinking about the perspective of the angels, hopefully some of their love will rub off on us. In other words, we want to think about how do the angels see the world? In other words, if I were an intensely emotional, spiritual being, what would my relationship with God look like? And why am I telling you that story? Because I want to have a little taste of that. That's the first blessing. What's the second blessing? The second blessing is called Ahavat Olam Haftanu. You, God, loved us with everlasting love. And we describe God's love to us, referring to taking us out of Egypt, etc. So now, says the Hasidic philosophy, isn't this beautiful? We start in the preparation of the Shema. We start by thinking about the relationship of God and the angels, but then we go to a higher level. What's the higher level? God and the soul. And they say that's reflected in this verse 3, that the apple tree amongst the trees of the forest. What is apple? We said apple is compassion. And that's the blessing right before the Shema. God's compassion to us. That's what's Ahavat Olam Avtanu. It actually says, you loved us with an everlasting love. But then the next words is, Chemla Gdola v'Yitera Chamalta Aleinu. You had exceedingly great compassion on us. Which means we're not perfect. We're not like the angels. We're not deserving. But nevertheless, God has compassion on us. So that's the definition of compassion as we discussed it. So that's for Zina. So the point here is that we start with the contrast. The angels are very spiritual. The angels are very holy. They sing God's praises. They're deserving. Their relationship with their passion to God is intense. That's step number one. But our love to God, and God's compassion to us in some ways is even greater, because that's the blend of compassion. And that's the idea of the two blessings, how we move first from the song of the angels, and then we go to the song of the souls. That's like the apple. My beloved is the relationship of the soul with God compared to the trees of the forest and the other sons, which is a metaphor for the angels' relationship with God. So this is the story in short. I hope it was interesting. A lot of details here, but what's happening here, again, from the spiritual perspective, from the Kabbalistic perspective, is that we're talking about God's love that is awakened because of the judgment. Just like we said earlier about the thorns, that the thorns provoke the they prickle and move and provoke and rub the rose, and that allows the rose's scent to spread. Because you can have the greatest in right in our driveway, we have a lot of mint, and the mint grows big, and we have to cut it. But we don't cut it. Sometimes we drive over the mint, and you drive over the mint, and you come out of the car, and you feel like you're in the Garden of Eden. You feel like you're in paradise. Why? Because the plant, you have to move it around to be able to get the smell. So same thing here. When we are challenged with the foreign loves, in some sense it's a threat, but in some sense the love of God is intensified. And similarly, when we are judged on Rosh Hashanah, when you have that Rosh Hashanah where we think about our imperfections, we think about the gap between us and God. That's represented with the sons of God. The sons of God is the angels who say, listen, in comparison to us, what are the souls? The souls are not focused on their, do not have an intense relationship with God the way the angels do. So Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur is really a time when we compare ourselves to the angels. We compare ourselves to our true potential, and then we feel distant. We feel the gap between us and God. Nevertheless, what's the result of this gap? The result of this gap is that we have a greater desire to God, and that elicits God's compassion to us. And then when do we celebrate that? We celebrate that in the second half of the month of Sukkot. So we just follow the entire year, the entire month of a holiday of Sukkot, which is the full spectrum of the relationship with God. We don't have too much time to elaborate. We'll do it next week. That because God is infinite, you're always going to have that mix of energies. There's going to be a feeling of distance, but there's also a feeling of closeness. But even after the closeness, there's more distance because God is infinite. So that's the dance of the relationship. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the story in short. So many details. Wasn't able to explain everything perhaps fully, but enough to go to the next verse, I think, because there's so much to do, and we're lovesick. We just want to move ahead. So there's God willing and good health.
Rabbi,
yes.
How do you reconcile that the concept of the apple with compassion, when in Genesis the apple represents the opposite, the forbidden, conflicting fruit?
Okay, so the first thing I would tell you is that Genesis, you'd be surprised because it's in popular culture, but it's not in the Torah. The Torah does not say whether what the fruit of the tree was. So apple just got a bad rap, but that does not come from Christian sources. In the Talmud, there are multiple opinions of what the fruit is, and I don't think any of them is an apple. There may be one, not in the Talmud, but in the Medrash. If I had to guess what the simple meaning of the story is, Rashi says it wasn't the apple. Rashi says it was a fig, because after the sin, they cover themselves with fig leaves. Why fig leaves? Because it was a fig tree. But even if not, the other one opinion in the Talmud says it was grain, actually. Another opinion says it was a vine, it was grape, which is also interesting. But the apple, I don't know, the apple got a very bad PR. It was mixed into that story by absolutely no fault of its own.
Oh, thanks. Now I can eat apples.
Now, when you read the apple, the apple in biblical literature, as you see here, the apple is a metaphor for beauty, for the love, for the relationship. Compare it to the trees of the forest, which are barren. The apple has fruit and has taste and has fragrance. The apple is beautiful.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a good Shabbos.
I actually had my apple for breakfast today. Usually I have breakfast a little later, but today I had my breakfast. I already had the apple today, so that's by divine providence. Wonderful.
Good, you keep the doctor away.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
A wonderful
Shabbat
day.
Shalom, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Beautiful.